The old man's world is a map of aches. There's the dull throb in his lower back that speaks of 50 years bent over a creek bed, the sharp complaint in his knees that marks each sunrise, and the hollow ache in his chest that has no name and no season. He moves through his days by the rhythm of these pains, a slow, deliberate metronome of survival. His name is Silas, though the wind is the only one who uses it anymore. He stands in the creek, the icy water a familiar shock around his shins. The sun is a merciless hammer in the vast, empty sky, beating down on the cracked earth and the stooped figure of the man who refused to leave it. His pickaxe rises and falls, a motion so practiced it requires no thought, only endurance. Rise, strike, scrape. Rise, strike, scrape. He is not searching for a fortune anymore. That dream died decades ago, its bones bleached white under this same relentless sun. Now he digs for habit. He digs for food. He digs because he no longer knows how to stand still. Today, the strike is different. Not the gritty scrape of stone on stone, nor the soft, promising thud of his pick sinking into clay. It is a sharp, metallic clink that travels up the hickory handle and into the bones of his arms. A sound out of place. He stops, head cocked, listening to the sudden silence broken only by the gurgle of the creek and the buzz of a horsefly. He has found things before: a rusted mule shoe, a shattered whiskey bottle, the button from a Union coat. Debris of the forgotten. He kneels, the water swirling around his patched trousers, and his gnarled fingers begin to probe the loose gravel. They close around something small, rectangular, and cold. He works it free and brings it into the light. It's a small tin box, the kind that once held tobacco or perhaps expensive tea. It is dark with corrosion, sealed shut by a half-century of mud and minerals. He carries it to the bank, his heart thumping with a strange, unfamiliar curiosity. He sets it on a flat rock and uses the tip of his knife to pry at the rusted seam. With a groan of tortured metal, the lid gives way. Inside, nestled on a bed of rotted, blackened velvet, lies a silver locket. It is tarnished almost to black, but the elegant shape is unmistakable, a small, heart-shaped promise from another lifetime. His breath catches in his throat. His hands, usually so steady in their work, tremble as he lifts it. The chain is broken, but the locket itself is whole. He scrapes a thumb across its surface, revealing a faint floral etching beneath the grime. The clasp is stiff, but he works it with a patient desperation. It clicks open. The world narrows to the two tiny, hinged frames in his palm. On the right, protected by a sliver of glass, is a miniature portrait, exquisitely painted. A young woman's face looks up at him. Her hair is the color of dark honey, swept up from a delicate neck. Her eyes are the deep, clear blue of a mountain lake, and her mouth holds the ghost of a smile, a secret meant only for the one holding the locket. On the left side, where the other portrait should be, there is only an empty, tarnished hollow. A void. A question. The face in the portrait undoes him. It is a key turning in a lock he had forgotten existed, opening a door to a room filled with ghosts. The aches in his body are suddenly drowned out by the singular, crushing ache of memory. A name, a word he has not allowed his tongue to form in 50 years, rises from the dust of his soul and escapes his lips in a ragged whisper. Alara. And with that single word, the dam of time breaks, and the past comes rushing in, as wild and unforgiving as the creek in a spring flood. There's more to this old prospector than meets the eye. Before his past comes rushing back, tell us, what's a memory you'd give anything to relive? And if you love a story of enduring love, hit like and subscribe. The man who whispered her name was not the man who stood stooped and broken in the creek bed. The man who had known her was young, straight-backed, and filled with a reckless hope that felt, in this distant future, like a form of madness. He had been 20 years old, and his name was Silas Blackwood. He had come to California in the great fever of '49, drawn by whispers of mountains made of gold and rivers that ran yellow with fortune. He'd left behind a hardscrabble farm in Missouri and a future that promised nothing but blisters and debt. He had a strong back, calloused hands, and a belief, as bright and foolish as a newly minted eagle, that he could carve a new destiny for himself out of the unforgiving Western earth. The reality of the gold fields was a brutal awakening. He found himself in a camp called Hangman's Gulch, a name earned with grim honesty. It was less a town and more a wound on the landscape, a chaotic sprawl of canvas tents, rough-hewn shacks, and open-air saloons clinging to the banks of a muddy, overworked creek. The air was thick with the reek of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and the metallic tang of desperation. Men from every corner of the world swirled together in a frantic, muddy dance of greed. They were farmers and clerks, sailors and scoundrels, all consumed by the same burning fever. Fights were common, murder not unheard of, and justice was a swift, simple affair conducted at the end of a rope slung over the branch of a sturdy oak. Silas staked a small claim upriver from the main camp, a section of creek others had deemed picked over. He worked from before sunrise until his muscles screamed in the twilight, standing waist-deep in the frigid water, washing pan after pan of gravel. Days bled into weeks, and his haul was meager. A few flakes of dust, the occasional tiny nugget no bigger than a grain of corn. It was enough to buy beans and bacon, but it was a far cry from the fortune he had imagined. The hope inside him began to tarnish, like cheap silver. He saw what the gold fever did to men. He saw them waste their dust on watered-down liquor and crooked card games. He saw them turn on each other over a few ounces of yellow metal, their eyes hollowed out by suspicion and envy. He saw their dreams curdle into bitterness. He vowed it would not happen to him. He held on to a core of himself, a quiet determination that was more stubbornness than hope. It was during one of his weekly trips to the camp supply store that he first saw her. The store was run by a man named Alistair Finch, a stern, pinched-faced merchant from Boston who seemed to despise the very ground he walked on. But his daughter, Elara, was like a wildflower that had somehow bloomed in a gravel pit. She moved with a quiet grace amidst the chaos, her presence a balm on the raw, frantic energy of the camp. While the few other women in Hangman's Gulch were either hardened saloon girls with weary eyes or exhausted wives of other miners, Elara was different. She had a gentle civility about her, a stillness that drew the eye. Silas watched her from afar at first, too intimidated to speak. He watched how she treated the miners, even the roughest among them, with a polite dignity they rarely received elsewhere. He saw the way she handled the dusty ledgers, her brow furrowed in concentration, and the way she would sometimes pause and look out the store's grimy window towards the distant, pine-covered mountains, a flicker of longing in her blue eyes. One sweltering afternoon, he finally worked up the nerve. He had come to buy a new shovel, his old one having split its handle. As Elara's father tallied the cost, Silas noticed a small, leather-bound book on the counter. He reached out and touched its cover. "What's this?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Elara looked up from her work. "It's poetry," she said, her voice softer than he'd imagined. Keats. He had no idea who Keats was. Reading was a luxury his life had never afforded. He could sign his name and puzzle out a broadsheet, but a book of poetry was as foreign to him as the moon. He felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. "Oh," was all he could manage. A flicker of understanding, not pity, crossed her face. "My mother loved his work," she offered gently. She said it was like finding flowers in a world of stone. The phrase struck him. That's what she was. A flower in a world of stone. He paid for his shovel and left, the book forgotten on the counter but her words echoing in his mind. The next week, he returned. He didn't need anything, but he found himself inventing a reason, a question about the price of flour, a query about when the next supply wagon was due. They spoke for only a minute, but it was enough. The week after that, he brought her something. It was a small, perfectly formed gold nugget, shaped like a teardrop. It wasn't worth much, maybe $1, but he had spent an entire afternoon carefully panning for something beautiful, not valuable. He offered it to her awkwardly, his large, calloused hand looking clumsy and out of place holding the delicate piece of gold. "I found this," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. "It made me think of what you said. About flowers." Elara took it, her fingers brushing his. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him. She looked at the nugget, then up at him, and for the first time, he saw a genuine, unguarded smile light up her face. It transformed her from being merely pretty to being truly beautiful. "Thank you, Silas," she said, and the sound of his own name on her lips was the richest strike he'd ever made. That small gift was the beginning. Their conversations grew from minutes to stolen quarters of an hour. He would linger in the store, listening to her talk about the life she'd known back east, a world of green lawns and quiet libraries that sounded like a fairy tale. In return, he told her about the farm in Missouri, about the vast, open sky and the smell of the earth after a rain. He found himself speaking of things he hadn't thought about in years, unlocking parts of himself he'd thought were long buried. She began to read to him. After her father had retired for the evening, she would sometimes sit on the porch of the store, and if Silas was there, she would open her book of Keats. Her voice was a gentle melody against the raucous backdrop of the camp's nightly revelry. He didn't always understand the words, the fancy language and strange rhymes, but he understood the feeling behind them. He understood the beauty and the sadness, the longing and the love. He was falling in love with her, a quiet, desperate, and terrifying thing. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed. The most powerful man in Hangman's Gulch was Jedediah Kane. Kane was everything Silas was not. He had arrived early, staked a massive claim on the richest part of the creek, and had the luck and ruthlessness to hold on to it. He lived in a large, defensible cabin built of proper timber, not a canvas tent. He employed a half-dozen men to work his claim and to act as his personal guards. He dressed in tailored clothes that seemed immune to the camp's pervasive mud and grime, and he dripped with a casual arrogance that came from knowing he could buy or break anyone he pleased. And Jedediah Kane wanted Alara Finch. He made no secret of it. He was a frequent visitor to the store, buying supplies he didn't need, his eyes lingering on Alara with a proprietary air. He would bring her expensive gifts from San Francisco, silk ribbons, French perfume, things that were laughably out of place in the Gulch but served as a blatant display of his wealth. Alara was always polite, her composure unshakable, but Silas could see the discomfort in her eyes, the way she subtly recoiled from Kane's presence. Kane saw Silas, too. He saw the way Alara's face softened when the young prospector entered the store. He saw the lingering conversations, the shared glances, and he saw Silas not as a rival, but as an insect to be brushed aside. The tension simmered beneath the surface of the camp's daily life. It was a world built on a fragile hierarchy of luck and force, and Kane was at the top. Silas was at the bottom. Their shared affection for Alara set them on a collision course, and in Hangman's Gulch, collisions were rarely gentle. The quiet moments Silas and Alara shared became more precious, more fragile, imbued with a sense of borrowed time. The locket, when he found it in a traveling peddler's wagon, felt like an anchor in a storm. It was a solid, tangible thing, a promise he could hold in his hand. He had saved for 2 months to afford it, trading his dust bit by bit, foregoing tobacco and even skimping on bacon. The peddler, a wiry man with shifty eyes, had assured him it was solid silver. Silas didn't care. He cared about the delicate etching of vines around its heart-shaped border and the satisfying weight of it in his palm. He bought it and tucked it away, waiting for the right moment. That moment came on a cool evening, under a sliver of a moon. He had asked Alara to meet him by the old oak at the edge of the camp, the one they called the Hanging Tree. It was a grim landmark, but it was far enough away from the noise and prying eyes of the main settlement to afford them a measure of privacy. She came, a dark shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her face pale in the moonlight. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice hushed. He shook his head, his throat suddenly tight. He pulled the locket from his pocket. It gleamed, freshly polished, under the scant starlight. I got this for you." He pressed it into her hand. She gasped softly, her fingers closing around it. She opened it, looked at the empty frames, then back at him, her eyes wide with a question. "It's a promise," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "A promise that I'm going to make something of myself. I'm going to find a real strike, enough to get us away from this place. We can get a piece of land, somewhere green, somewhere quiet. And when I've done it, I'll have my portrait made, proper, in San Francisco, to put next to yours." He hadn't even asked if she would have him. He hadn't dared. But in that moment, looking at her face, he saw his answer. Tears welled in her eyes, shimmering in the moonlight. She didn't speak. She simply rose on her toes and kissed him. It was a soft, hesitant kiss, tasting of hope and fear and the dust of the trail. It was the first time, and it sealed the promise between them more surely than any words could have. She put the locket on, the silver chain cool against her skin, and tucked it beneath the collar of her dress. It was their secret, a hidden weight of shared dreams against her heart. Their secret meetings by the oak tree became their sanctuary. They talked for hours, planning a future that felt both impossibly distant and breathtakingly close. He would describe the farm he envisioned, with a small white house and a porch swing. She would describe the books she would fill it with, the garden she would plant. In those moments, Hangman's Gulch and its frantic, grubby reality faded away, and they were just two people building a world out of words and wishes. But the real world had a way of intruding. Jedediah Kane's attentions grew more persistent. He began to position himself as a suitor in a more formal way, spending long hours in the store speaking with Alara's father. Alistair Finch, whose business was struggling under the weight of unreliable supply lines and the miners' mounting debts, was receptive to Kane's overtures. Silas could see the calculation in the older man's eyes. Kane represented security, a way out of the precarious existence of the camp. Silas represented nothing, a penniless prospector with empty hands and a heart full of foolish dreams. One afternoon, as Silas was leaving the store, Kane was waiting for him outside. He was leaning against a support post, casually whittling a piece of wood with a pearl-handled knife. Two of his hired men stood a few feet away, their expressions blank and watchful. "Blackwood," Kane said, not looking up from his whittling. His voice was smooth, almost pleasant, but it held an undercurrent of menace as sharp as the blade in his hand. "Working hard. Hard enough," Silas replied, his hand instinctively balling into a fist at his side. He kept his voice even. Kane finally looked up, his eyes cold and assessing. He flicked a wood shaving from his knife. "A man can work himself into an early grave in this country and have nothing to show for it but dirt under his nails. It takes more than sweat to get ahead. It takes capital. It takes vision." He paused, letting his gaze drift towards the store's entrance. "And it takes knowing what's yours for the taking and what isn't." The threat was unmistakable. Silas felt a hot surge of anger, but he held it in check. A brawl would solve nothing. It would only get him beaten, or worse, and prove Kane's point that he was just another hot-headed fool. "Some things aren't for sale, Kane," Silas said quietly. Kane chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Everything's for sale, son. Everything and everyone. You just have to know the price." He snapped his knife shut and pushed himself off the post. "You'd do well to remember that. Stick to your digging. It's what you're good at." He walked away, his men falling in step behind him, leaving Silas standing in the dusty street, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and chilling fear. The lines had been drawn. It was no longer just a matter of winning Alara's heart. It was a race against a man who believed he could simply buy it. The confrontation with Kane lit a fire under Silas. His work on the claim took on a new, desperate intensity. Every swing of the pick, every pan of gravel, was a blow against Kane, a prayer for his future with Alara. He worked past exhaustion, his muscles burning, his mind focused on a single image, Alara's face, her smile, the promise of the life they would build together. He was no longer just digging for gold. He was digging for freedom. Alara, for her part, found her own quiet ways to rebel. She knew her father was being courted by Kane's wealth, and the pressure on her was immense, a silent, daily weight. When Silas came to the store, she would find ways to help him. She'd sell him the best quality flour and bacon, marking it down in the ledger as damaged goods. She'd make sure he got a new, sturdy pickaxe handle, claiming the old stock was warped. They were small acts of defiance, tiny rebellions of the heart, that bound them closer together. She was investing in him, in their shared dream, with the only currency she had. Then, one blistering afternoon, it happened. Silas was clearing away a section of loose rock at the edge of his claim when his pick struck something that wasn't bedrock. It was a narrow, diagonal seam of quartz, shot through with brilliant, unmistakable veins of yellow. His heart leaped into his throat. He worked frantically, his hands shaking, chipping away at the rock. It was a pocket vein, not the motherlode, but it was richer than anything he had ever seen. He spent the rest of the day carefully extracting the gold-laced quartz, his mind reeling. By dusk, he had a leather pouch that was heavy in his hand. It wasn't a fortune, not by Kane's standards. But it was enough. It was more than enough. It was seed money for a farm, passage away from this godforsaken gulch, a down payment on their future. It was the answer to his prayers. He felt a dizzying wave of triumph and relief wash over him. He had done it. He had beaten the odds. He washed in the creek, scrubbing the grime from his hands and face, and changed into his one clean shirt. He had to tell Alara. He had to show her, to lay their future at her feet and ask her to take it with him. He practically ran to the camp, the pouch of gold a heavy, reassuring weight against his hip. But as he approached the supply store, a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. A fine-looking wagon, pulled by two well-groomed horses, was hitched out front. It was Jedediah Kane's. Through the window, Silas could see Kane sitting at the table in the back room with Alastair Finch. A bottle of expensive whiskey sat between them, and Finch was laughing, a sound Silas had never heard from the dour man before. Alara was nowhere in sight. Silas's triumph curdled into suspicion. He lingered in the shadows across the street, watching, waiting. After nearly an hour, Kane emerged, clapping Finch on the back. They shook hands, a firm, sealing gesture. As Kane climbed into his wagon, he looked directly across the street, and his eyes met Silas's in the deepening twilight. A slow, triumphant smirk spread across his face before he snapped the reins and drove away. Silas knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that something terrible had just happened. The pouch of gold suddenly felt worthless. He waited until he was sure Kane was gone and Finch had closed the store for the night. He circled around to the back, to the small window of the room where Alara slept. He tossed a small pebble against the glass, his heart hammering against his ribs. After a moment, her silhouette appeared. She opened the window a crack. "Silas? You shouldn't be here. My father. I have to talk to you," he whispered urgently. "Meet me at the oak." She hesitated, then gave a single, sharp nod and closed the window. He waited for what felt like an eternity, the sounds of the night, the distant shouts from the saloons, the chirping of crickets, amplifying his anxiety. When she finally appeared, a wraith in the darkness, he could see that she had been crying. Her face was pale and tear-streaked. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rough with fear. "What did Kane do?" She wouldn't look at him. She stared at the ground, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "My father. He made an agreement with Mr. Kane," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A business partnership. Mr. Kane is investing in the store, saving it from ruin." Silas felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "And," he prompted, already knowing the answer. "And I am to be part of the bargain," she finally choked out, looking up at him, her eyes filled with a desperate, trapped anguish. "He asked for my hand. My father accepted." The word struck Silas like a physical blow. The air rushed from his lungs. He felt a white-hot rage, followed by a cold, hollowing despair. He reached out and gripped her arms. "No, you can't. We have a plan. Alara, look at me." He fumbled for the pouch at his belt. "I found it. Today. I found it. It's enough. We can leave tonight. Right now." He tried to press the pouch into her hands, but she pushed it away. "It's not that simple, Silas. My father, he's given his word. He says I have a duty. He says this is for our survival." "What about our survival?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "What about us?" Tears streamed freely down her face now. "I don't know what to do," she sobbed. "He's my father. But I can't. I won't marry that man." She reached up and her cold fingers fumbled at the collar of her dress. She drew out the locket. It seemed to catch the faint starlight, a tiny beacon in the crushing darkness. She unclasped it and pressed it firmly into his hand. Her hand was trembling violently. "Keep it safe," she whispered, her voice fierce and desperate. "Keep it safe for me, Silas, until you can come for me. Properly." He stared at her, confused by her words, by the raw panic in her eyes. He thought she was rejecting him, telling him that his small strike wasn't enough, that he needed to come back a rich man, a man who could challenge Kane on his own terms. He misunderstood her desperate plea for a practical demand. His own panic and hurt clouded his judgment. He saw her action not as an act of faith, giving him their symbolic promise to guard, but as a painful postponement, a test he had yet to pass. "I will," he vowed, his voice thick with a new, grim determination. He would go back to the claim. He would tear that mountain apart with his bare hands if he had to. He would find the motherlode. He would come back for her a king and lay Cain's whole world to ruin. He saw it as a challenge to his worth. She saw it as a desperate prayer for rescue. "Promise me, Silas," she said, gripping his hand that held the locket. "I promise," he said. And then she was gone, melting back into the shadows, leaving him alone with a heavy pouch of gold that suddenly felt like a handful of dust, and a silver locket that felt like the weight of the entire world. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the embers of his fire, the locket clutched in his fist, his mind a maelstrom of fury and despair. Alara's words echoed in his head, "Until you can come for me." Properly. He had to get more gold. He had to prove to her father, to the whole damned world, that he was worthy. The vein he'd found was just the start. He would go back at first light and dig deeper, harder than ever before. But the world had other plans. He awoke not to the gentle gray of dawn, but to a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The air was thick and heavy, and a strange, oppressive silence had fallen over the gulch. The wind began to pick up, whining through the canyons like a hungry animal. Within the hour, the sky opened up. It wasn't just rain. It was a deluge, a solid sheet of water that turned the dusty ground to thick, clinging mud in minutes. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. Silas huddled in his flimsy tent, listening to the storm's fury, his anxiety growing with every passing moment. The creek, normally a placid, manageable stream, began to swell. He could hear it roaring, a deep, angry sound that grew louder and louder. The storm raged for 2 days without cease. When it finally broke, and a weak, watery sun emerged, Silas crawled out of his tent to a scene of utter devastation. The entire landscape had been transformed. The creek had become a raging, muddy torrent, 3 times its normal size. It had jumped its banks, carving a new, violent path through the camp. Tents were washed away, sluice boxes smashed to splinters, and entire claims had simply vanished beneath a thick layer of silt and debris. His heart in his throat, Silas scrambled towards his own claim. It was gone. The place where he had worked, where he had found the vein of quartz that held his future, was now just a churning expanse of brown water. The rock face was gone, the tools were gone, the hope was gone. Everything had been washed away. He stood on the muddy, unstable bank, staring at the destruction, a single, cold thought echoing in the sudden, ringing silence of his mind. "I have nothing." The pouch of gold from the vein was still with him, a cruel reminder of the future that had been snatched away. It was a pittance now, barely enough to get him out of the territory, let alone enough to challenge a man like Jedediah Cain. He was ruined, defeated. He sank to his knees in the mud, the cold seeping into his bones, and felt a despair so profound it was like drowning. It was later that day, as he was numbly trying to salvage what little he could from the wreckage of his camp, that a fellow prospector, a man named Dusty, slogged through the mud to find him. Dusty's face was grim. "Heard the news, Blackwood?" he asked, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. Silas just shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. "Cain," Dusty said, confirming Silas's worst fears. "Rode into what's left of the camp this morning. Seems the storm didn't touch his claim up on the high ground. He announced he's talking a bride, the storekeeper's girl, buying around for any man who'll drink to his health at the saloon tonight. A celebration, he's calling it." The words hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. A celebration. While men were ruined, while their entire world was washed away, Cain was celebrating his victory. He had won. He had used his wealth and the storm's destruction to corner Alara completely. There was no hope for her now. Silas had failed. He had promised to come for her, and he had failed. He stumbled through the devastated camp, his mind a blur of grief and rage. He saw the faces of the other miners, etched with defeat. He heard the distant, tinny sound of a piano from the saloon, a grotesque counterpoint to the ruin surrounding them. He pictured Alara, her face pale, her eyes empty, standing beside Cain. The image was a knife in his gut. He reached into his pocket, and his fingers closed around the locket. It was cool and smooth against his skin. "Keep it safe, until you can come for me." And suddenly, the words meant something different. A jolt, sharp as lightning, went through him. He had been a fool, an utter fool. She hadn't been asking for wealth. She hadn't been testing his ability to provide. She had been asking for him. She was telling him she was trapped and needed him to save her. It wasn't about coming for her properly with a fortune. It was about coming for her, period. It was a desperate cry for help, a plea for rescue, and he had been too blinded by his own pride and panic to see it. The despair in his soul burned away, replaced by a cold, clarifying rage. He was not defeated. Not yet. He had lost his claim, his tools, his gold. But he still had his 2 feet. He still had the heart that beat in his chest. And he still had her promise, cold and solid in his hand. He looked down at himself. He was covered in mud, his clothes were torn, and he hadn't eaten in 2 days. He looked like what he was, a broken man. But inside, a new and terrible resolve was taking shape. He would not let Cain win. He would not let Alara be sold like a piece of property. He turned his back on the wreckage of his claim and began to walk. He walked through the mud and the debris, past the defeated faces of the other men. His steps were slow at first, then faster, more purposeful. He was walking towards the saloon, towards the sound of the mocking piano music, towards the man who had taken everything from him. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have a weapon. He had nothing but a desperate love and a silver locket. He was going to get Alara. The Golden Garter Saloon was an island of defiant noise in a sea of muddy silence. Its lamps cast a greasy yellow light out into the twilight, illuminating the churned-up street and the weary figures trudging through it. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool, stale beer, and the cheap perfume worn by the saloon girls. The piano player was hammering out a jaunty, soulless tune that grated on Silas's raw nerves. A crowd of miners, those who hadn't been completely washed out or had chosen to drown their sorrows, were clustered around the bar, taking advantage of Jedediah Cain's largesse. Cain himself stood near the center of the room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, holding court. He was immaculate as always, his black coat and polished boots a stark contrast to the mud-caked men he was buying drinks for. He was laughing, expansive, a king surveying his grim domain. Near him, looking small and fragile, stood Alastair Finch, a strained, sycophantic smile plastered on his face. Alara was not there. For that, Silas was grateful. He pushed through the swinging doors, and the room fell silent. The piano player's hands faltered on the keys. Every eye turned to him. He was a specter of the storm, caked in mud from boot to shoulder, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. He looked like a man who had crawled out of his own grave. Cain's smile tightened. He set his whiskey glass down on a nearby table. Well, he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. Look what the flood washed in. I thought you'd have been halfway to Nevada by now, Blackwood. Looking for a new patch of dirt to scratch in. A few of the men chuckled nervously. Silas ignored them. He ignored Cain. His gaze swept the room, searching. I'm here for Alara, he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the suddenly silent room. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. Cain's condescension hardened into a sneer. You're here for nothing, he said, taking a step forward. His 2 ever-present Minders moved to flank him. Miss Finch is my fiancée. We are to be married. It's a private matter, and it has absolutely nothing to do with you. Now, I suggest you turn around and crawl back to whatever hole you came from before you embarrass yourself further. I'm not leaving without her, Silas said, his voice as steady as bedrock. He took a step forward, into the lamplight. You have no claim here, boy. Alastair Finch suddenly piped up, his voice shrill with panic. This is a family matter. A business arrangement. You have no say. Let her have her say, Silas shot back, his eyes still locked on Cain. Let her tell me herself that she wants this. Cain laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. She doesn't need to tell you anything. Her father has given his consent. The matter is settled. He gestured to his men. Show our friend the door. Gently, if possible. The 2 thugs started forward, but Silas didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket. He held it up, letting it swing gently on its broken chain. It caught the lamplight, a small, defiant spark in the grimy room. She gave me this, Silas said, his voice resonating with a simple, unshakable truth that cut through the tension. She asked me to keep it safe for her. At that moment, as if summoned by his words, the door to the back room opened and Alara stepped out. She must have heard the commotion. Her face was deathly pale, her eyes wide and haunted. She wore a dress of dark blue silk, a gift from Cain, no doubt. It looked like a shroud on her. She saw Silas standing there, muddy and defiant, holding the locket, and a small, choked gasp escaped her lips. "Alara," Cain said, his voice sharp, proprietary. "Go back inside. This doesn't concern you." But she didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on Silas, on the locket, on the promise dangling between them. The entire saloon held its breath, watching the silent drama unfold. The miners, men who lived and died by luck and grit, men who knew the sting of loss and the value of a true heart, watched with a deep, primal interest. This was a fight not of fists, but of something far more fundamental. "Silas," she whispered, the name a prayer. He took another step towards her, holding the locket out in his open palm. "I'm here," he said softly, "for her alone. Like I promised." That was all it took. The spell of fear and duty that had held her captive was broken. The carefully constructed world of Cain and her father shattered into 1,000 pieces. With a small cry, she gathered her skirts and ran. Not to her father, not to her wealthy fiancé, but to the mud-caked prospector with nothing to his name but the love in his eyes. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, as if he could shield her from the entire world. It was a moment of pure, unassailable truth. Cain's face contorted into a mask of pure fury. The public humiliation was more than he could bear. "Get her," he roared at his men. "Get her away from him." But as his men moved to obey, a low growl rumbled through the crowd of miners. A big, bearded man stepped forward, blocking their path. "Leave him be," he said, his voice a gravelly warning. Another man joined him, and then another. They formed a silent, human wall between the couple and Cain. They were poor men, broken men, but they recognized something real and worth defending. They had seen enough of Cain's bullying and his arrogance. Tonight, they had seen enough. Cain stared at the wall of hostile faces, then at Silas and Alara, and he knew he had lost. His power, built on money and fear, had evaporated in an instant. He could not force a woman's heart, and he could not fight an entire room of men who had nothing left to lose. With a final, venomous glare, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the saloon, his grand celebration in ruins. Alistair Finch spluttered, his face purple with rage and shame, but no one was listening. Alara pulled back from Silas, her hands framing his face. There were tears on her cheeks, but for the first time in days, her eyes were shining with life. "Let's go," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Let's go now." He nodded, his heart too full for words. Hand in hand, they walked out of the saloon, leaving her father and her silk dress and the whole sorry mess behind them. They stepped out into the night, into the mud and the devastation, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a future as uncertain as the dark road ahead. But they were together, and for the first time in a long time, they were free. The memory, 50 years old, was as sharp and clear as if it had happened yesterday. The elation of their escape, the terror and the triumph of it, still echoed in the old man's heart. They had walked out of Hangman's Gulch that night and never looked back. They had the pouch of gold Silas had found, a small stake to start their new life. They walked for days, heading east, away from the madness of the gold fields, towards the promise of the green, quiet land they had dreamed of. Those weeks on the trail were the happiest of his life. The hardship was immense. They slept on the hard ground. Their food was meager, and the journey was fraught with peril, but none of it mattered. They had each other. The world was new and vibrant. He saw it through her eyes, the startling blue of a jay's wing, the intricate pattern of frost on a blade of grass, the majesty of the star-dusted sky at night. She read to him from the book of Keats she had managed to bring with her, her voice a soft murmur against the crackle of their campfire. They talked and dreamed, their future a blank page they would write together. The grime and greed of Hangman's Gulch felt a lifetime away. He had never felt so rich. But the West was an unforgiving place. It gave, and it took away with a cruel indifference. They were making their way through a small, nameless settlement, little more than a trading post and a few scattered cabins, when Alara fell ill. At first, it was just a fever, a weariness he attributed to the hard journey. He made her rest, brewed her teas from herbs he recognized, and tended to her with a gentle, worried hand. But the fever didn't break. It worsened, consuming her, leaving her weak and delirious. He traded one of his few remaining gold nuggets for a room in the back of the trading post, a small, airless space that smelled of dust and decay. He sat by her side day and night, bathing her forehead with cool water, whispering to her, pleading with whatever god might be listening. The post owner's wife, a grim-faced woman with kind eyes, told him it was cholera. She had seen it before. There was nothing to be done. Alara faded. There were moments of lucidity, when her blue eyes would clear and she would look at him, her hand weakly gripping his. During one of those moments, she made him promise. "Don't let it end with me, Silas," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "You have to live. Find a good piece of land. Live a life for both of us. Promise me." He promised, his voice choked with tears he could not stop. He would have promised her the moon and the stars if she had asked. She died 2 days later, just after dawn, her head in his lap. He held her, rocking her gently, the silence in the room a deafening roar. The light of his world had gone out. He used the last of his gold to buy a simple pine box and a plot of land on a small, windswept hill overlooking the settlement. He buried her himself, the work of digging the grave a numb, mechanical agony. Before he filled it in, he stood over the box, the silver locket in his hand. He looked at her perfect, smiling face in the miniature portrait. He couldn't bear it. The sight of it was a physical pain, a reminder of everything he had fought for and everything he had lost. With a cry of pure anguish, he threw the locket into the grave. He threw the Book of Keats in after it. He buried his love, his promise, his entire future, under 6 feet of cold, unforgiving earth. He shoveled the dirt with a frantic, desperate energy, as if he could bury the pain itself. When it was done, he fashioned a simple cross from 2 pieces of scrap wood and drove it into the fresh mound of earth. He didn't carve her name. He couldn't. He walked away from that grave and never looked back. He became a ghost, a wanderer. The man named Silas Blackwood died on that hill with Alara. The creature that was left was just a prospector, a man who dug in the dirt because it was the only thing he knew how to do. He drifted from camp to camp, his heart walled off, his memories locked away in a room whose key he had thrown away. Eventually, drawn by some subconscious, magnetic pull he never understood, he had ended up here, in this desolate canyon, scratching at the earth for 50 years, not 20 miles from the place where he had buried his heart. He had been digging near her grave all this time, a penance he hadn't even known he was serving. The sun is rising now, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. The old man, Silas, sits by the cold ashes of his campfire. The locket lies in his palm, its silver warmed by his touch. The flood of memory has receded, leaving behind not the sharp, jagged edges of grief, but a deep, quiet calm. He understands now. The guilt that has been his silent companion for half a century, the corrosive belief that he had failed her, begins to dissolve in the morning light. He hadn't failed. He had fought for her. He had won her. And they had been happy. Fate had stolen her from him, not his own inadequacy. Their love wasn't a tragedy of failure. It was a beautiful, perfect story cut short. And he had kept his promise. He had lived. It had not been the life they planned, but it had been a life. He had endured. Slowly, stiffly, he gets to his feet. The aches are still there, the familiar chorus of his aging body, but the hollow ache in his chest is gone. He moves around his small, ramshackle camp with a new purpose. He doesn't pack his pickaxe or his gold pan. He packs a small bundle, a canteen of water, a piece of dry jerky, his bedroll. He is leaving. For the first time in 50 years, he is not just moving on to another patch of dirt. He is going somewhere. He walks away from the creek, away from the camp that has been his prison and his sanctuary. He walks up the gentle slope of the nearby hill, his steps sure and steady. He stops before a small, weathered wooden cross, bleached gray by decades of sun and wind. It leans slightly, but it still stands. At its base, he kneels. He looks at the locket one last time. He looks at Alara's face, and this time he smiles. It's a small, rusty smile, but it is real. He doesn't bury the locket this time. He carefully lays it at the foot of the cross, propping it up against the wood so that her face is turned towards the rising sun. The silver glints, a tiny star against the weathered gray wood. He stands and looks out at the vast, empty landscape. It is no longer a symbol of his isolation, but simply a place. A beautiful, harsh, indifferent place where a great love had lived and died. He feels a profound sense of peace, of release. The past is no longer a weight that bends his back, but a story that has finally been told. He has remembered. He has honored her. And now, he can be free. He turns his back on the grave, on the locket shining in the sun, and begins to walk. He doesn't know where he is going, and for the first time in his life, it doesn't matter. He is simply walking, a very old man under a very big sky, finally at peace. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.